I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
Queen Elizabeth II was the longest reigning monarch in British history. During her 70 years on the throne, Her Majesty has witnessed incredible change, and so did the nation she ruled over. But there was always a constant in her life. Always by her side, Prince Philip was the man that offered her unconditional support and devotion. Through hardship and change, Elizabeth and Philip were inseparable for 73 years.
I think that the main lesson that we've learned is that tolerance is the one essential ingredient of any happy marriage. And you can take it from me that the Queen has the quality of tolerance and abundance.
All too often, I fear Prince Philip has had to listen to me speaking. He is someone who doesn't take easily to compliments, but he has quite simply been my strength and stay all these years. And I and his whole family owe him a debt greater than he would ever claim, or we shall ever know.
Their enduring love and unbreakable bond has been a staple of modern history. This is Elizabeth and Philip. Eternally yours. In 1926 Britain was a much different place, almost unrecognizable in fact. King George V was on the throne, and Britain was still recovering from the horrors of the Great War, World War I. The future Queen was born on a dull, ordinary rainy day on the 21st of April 1926.
Princess Elizabeth had a very, very happy childhood. She was born in 1926 in the centre of London, in Bruton Street, and it was 6 weeks before the general strike, so it was a time of great political turbulence. But there was still great excitement about this new royal baby. People were really interested in the royal family, although they never thought that she would be an heir to the throne, because at the time everyone loved the Prince of Wales, who of course was later the Duke of Windsor, who abdicated, but all eyes were on him. But this was a beautiful baby, and she was brought up by a series of nannies and nursemaids, and she had very loving parents, and they basically, in those days, people followed the sporting calendar. The winters were in hunting country, summers were in Scotland, and the season was in London. And Elizabeth had this idyllic childhood with her parents and horses and dogs, and also her loving grandparents. Princess Margaret was born in 1930, and Elizabeth looked after her. She was always really kind to her little sister, a beautiful little sister. And they had a very, very close relationship. They looked after each other, but obviously Elizabeth was the oldest. And so she kind of took charge of her little sister. But they were dressed identically. She was 4 years older, and yet they were wearing the same clothes, but that's how royal families dressed in those days. The outbreak of World War II affected the British royal family hugely, because they were right up there at Buckingham Palace, which was a big, big target for the German bombers. But they decided that they would not leave the country, they would stay there with their people, but they obviously had to look after their two daughters. Elizabeth and Margaret started in Scotland, then they were sent down south, and they eventually stayed at Windsor Castle for 5 years, while the King and Queen went to London during the week, and they wanted to be visible to their people. So they would go around the bombed areas, and meet the people. And obviously the king became very involved with the troops, and he would go and visit the troops. So they were a very big part of the PR war effort.
Once again, Londoners who have known nights of terror before return to their bombed-out homes. But the damage here cannot compare with devastated Berlin, where 1/3 of the city lies in ruins. Britain's beloved monarchs are on the scene a short while after, again demonstrating a human sympathy for their subjects, whose courage has never yet been shaken. But king, queen, or humble citizen, all veterans of the Blitz, demonstrate once more that London can still take it.
Elizabeth and Philip were first introduced to one another when Elizabeth was just 8 years old. According to eyewitnesses, it was at the wedding of Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, Philip's cousin, and Prince George, Duke of Kent, Elizabeth's uncle, in 1934. It wasn't until 5 years later, when Elizabeth was 13 and Philip was 18, that the two met again at the Royal Navy College in Dartmouth. This time, Elizabeth fell in love with the one who would later become her husband.
Princess Elizabeth met Prince Philip at a family wedding, but she can't really remember that moment. The reason we know so much about it is because her governess, Marion Crawford, talks in great detail about their first meeting at Dartmouth College, where Prince Philip was a naval cadet. And he was very, very good looking, 18 years old, very striking, blonde looking. And he was assigned to look after the two princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, for the day, for their visit, while their parents went around the college. I mean, it was quite strange to think of an 18-year-old looking after the princesses, the oldest of whom was 13. But he decided that it would be fun if they jumped the tennis nets. So he took the princesses outside and he jumped the tennis nets for them, and they were very, very impressed. Later he went on board the vessel that the King and Queen had come to Dartmouth in, and he had lunch, and then the following day he went and had tea. So that was the meeting that the princess remembers.
Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark was born in Monrepos on the Greek island of Corfu on the 10th of June 1921, the only son and fifth and final child of Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark and Princess Alice of Battenberg. After a suffocating loss during the Greco-Turkish War, a revolutionary court banished Philip's father from Greece for life, and he evacuated the country with his family aboard HMS Calypso. It was a difficult and strenuous upbringing, fraught with tragedy, moving from place to place. Philip finally found stability in the Royal Navy in 1939, when he became a cadet at the Royal Naval College, Dartmouth, the very place he would meet his future bride, Elizabeth.
Prince Philip was born on the Greek island of Corfu. His father was in the Greek army, and eventually the family were exiled from Greece and went to live in Paris, where Prince Philip was sent to school. Then his mother, who was mentally very fragile, went into a sanatorium, and it was decided that it would be better for Philip to be educated by his cousins in England. So he was sent to school in England and lived with his cousins, the Marchioness of Milford Haven, and then he eventually was sent to Gordonston. But all this made him very independent and very strong, and he never says, he always maintains he didn't have an unhappy childhood. It was probably a very interesting childhood because he travelled from a very, very early age, and also they were a very grand family. They were princes of Greece and Denmark, so they were related to both sides. And they were actually also related to all the houses of Europe. So they had a lot of very influential relations. And when there wasn't any money, their relations paid for them, as was the way it went in those days. His mother was Queen Victoria's great-granddaughter, and his mother was born in Windsor Castle, actually. And his mother was also Lord Louis Mountbatten's sister. Prince Philip fulfilled his military service in the Royal Navy. He was educated at Dartmouth College, and then he left college and went straight into the Navy, and he actually saw action, and he saw the Japanese surrender at the Battle of Matapan.
Elizabeth was just 21 when their engagement was announced on the 9th of July 1947. This event was not without controversy. Philip had no financial standing, was foreign-born, and had sisters who had married German noblemen with Nazi links. Before the marriage, Philip renounced his Greek and Danish titles, officially converted from Greek Orthodoxy to Anglicanism, and adopted the style Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, taking the surname of his mother's British family. Before the wedding, he was created Duke of Edinburgh and granted the style His Royal Highness.
When her engagement to Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten of the Royal Navy is announced, the heart of the world is thrilled by the prospect of one royal wedding with a genuine aura of romance. A former Greek prince, Philip gave up his Greek citizenship to become a British subject. On the eve of the wedding, the king elevates him to the peerage, and he becomes officially His Royal Highness Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, Earl of Merioneth, and Baron Greenwich. From all over Christendom, gorgeous and regal gifts pour into Buckingham Palace. Among them, lovely crystal pieces, including a delicately chased crystal bowl from the President of the United States. From prince and commoner, tokens of esteem and good wishes by the hundreds are acknowledged individually by Elizabeth, with the simple sincerity of any well-bred young woman who punctiliously observes the amenities despite the tremendous demands upon her time. This picnic hamper from Sister Margaret is covered with alligator skin. The Swiss watchmakers send one of their finest. From Burma and Bombay to Regent Street in London, jewels from governments and family have been showered on the bride.
Well, when Elizabeth and Philip got engaged, they decided that because London was ravaged by war and a lot of the buildings were absolutely rubble, and there was unemployment, there was rationing, it was in a really bad place. The king thought, well, let's have a very quiet wedding at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. No pomp, no ceremony, we'll just be very private. But then the government, surprisingly, said, no, 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 we need to lift the people's spirits. Let's have a beautiful royal wedding that everybody can see. So that is what ended up happening. And it was televised, and eventually the television got to America. So it became a global affair, and it did lift people's spirits in London hugely. To see this beautiful young couple married, no one had seen anything like that for the years of the war.
Elizabeth and Philip were married on the 20th of November 1947 at Westminster Abbey. They received 2,500 wedding gifts from around the world. Because Britain had not yet wholly recovered from the devastation of the war, Elizabeth required ration coupons to buy the material for her gown, which Norman Hartnell designed.
And now the great hour arrives as the Queen and Princess Margaret Rose leave Buckingham Palace for the ceremony at Westminster Abbey. And Prince Philip, with split-second timing, also departs for the great rendezvous. The royal standard waves over a truly royal occasion as the state coach, with Elizabeth and the King, is escorted to Westminster Abbey by the household of cavalry guards, a sovereign's escort. Pomp, pageantry, and splendor are revived for this day in austerity-ridden London, a day which the world shares with Britain. This is the moment for which the teeming millions have been waiting for months. A deep-throated roar swells in volume as cheering thousands greet the princess. The drabness of the day is forgotten. Here at Westminster Abbey, scene of splendor on great occasions through its 900 years of British history, the royal coach arrives at the great west door, through whose portals the mighty of old England have passed. It is a radiant bride-to-be, the loveliest the old Abbey has ever looked upon. Here at Britain's historic shrine, where all the kings have been crowned, Her Royal Highness, the Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, and His Royal Highness, Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, are wed in the same ceremony that has united English couples from village to palace for centuries. Here they plight their troth.
Ordinance.
In the proud words of King George, our daughter has married the man she loves. Elizabeth and Philip take their places on history's pages. To the stirring strains of Mendelssohn, they march as man and wife toward the west door amidst nearly 3,000 invited spectators. It is a deeply moving occasion, and yet a supremely happy one for the King and Queen as well as the Queen Mother. The Duke and Duchess of Gloucester and Duchess of Kent are followed by the royal couple of Holland.
In England, the man doesn't take the wife's title. The woman takes the husband. So when Princess Elizabeth became queen, he didn't become king because that was her title and it didn't pass to him. But conversely, when the Queen Mother became queen, she took her husband's title. So she was married to King George VI, and she was Queen Elizabeth because she took his title. But it doesn't work the other way round. Well, from Prince Philip's perspective, this is someone that had to leave their country. They didn't have a home of their own. All his sisters were married to German aristocracy and lived in enormous castles. And there's Philip, living off the goodwill of his relations. So I think that the idea of marrying a princess that was going to inherit so much must have been very attractive. And he was pushed by his uncle, Louis Mountbatten, who was the great kingmaker. And he really pushed Philip into kind of maintaining a relationship with Princess Elizabeth, who she was completely smitten with him from the age of 13. And I think she wrote to him to say, thank you for entertaining us at Dartmouth. And I suppose it gradually kept up. Then, of course, during the time when he was on leave, on shore leave, he often went to stay at Windsor Castle. And that's when their relationship became more serious. And eventually, he proposed to her at Balmoral.
Her Royal Highness is the proud and happy mother of a prince. The salute is fired, and in the monarch's home lies the infant boy who will one day be king. On Saturday, the eminent gynecologist Sir William Gilliot was called to the palace for the most responsible case in even his career. By his advice, Sister H.M. Rowe was chosen midwife. The whole country knew that the baby would soon be born. All day on Sunday, people waited outside the palace, including phlegmatic pressmen with whom it is a point of honor to show no excitement. And all day there was no announcement. It was after 10 at night that those who waited, and they were very many, heard the tremendous news, a royal baby and a boy. Radio gave no advantage to watchers at the palace. The glad tidings went out everywhere.
This is the BBC Home Service. It has been announced officially from Buckingham Palace during the past hour that Her Royal Highness, the Princess Elizabeth, Duchess of Edinburgh, was safely delivered of a prince at 9:14 p.m. today. And that Her Royal Highness and her son are both doing well.
The press agencies were covering the world. The miracles of modern communication spanned the globe. Unto us a child is born, and no ordinary child, a prince. For the moment, all other news took second place. The morning newspapers went to press with one of those rare, warm stories that touch every heart. Cable and radio brought thousands of messages of congratulation from every corner of the Commonwealth. The young royal mother, herself a child but little more than yesterday, lay at her parents' home, an infant prince at her side. By custom, the Home Secretary was among the first informed. When he arrived at the Home Office next morning, the announcement hung outside. Mr. Chutereed was not called to the palace. No one feared in this day and age that some other child would be foisted on the nation. Privileged on this royal occasion to drive through Marble Arch into the park were a king's troop of Royal Horse Artillery. It was their honor and proud duty to fire the salute of 41 guns announcing the birth of a prince.
Elizabeth gave birth to her first child, Prince Charles, on the 14th of November 1948. 1 month earlier, the king had issued letters patent, allowing her children to use the style and title of a royal prince or princess, to which they otherwise would not have been entitled, as their father was no longer a royal prince.
Prince Philip was so happy that his firstborn should be a son and heir. But he wanted his son to be an image of himself. He wanted him to be macho, and he wanted him to be sporty, and he wanted him to have a sort of very strong personality. Well, Charles wasn't like that at all. He was very timid. He wasn't particularly sporty. He was a little awkward, and he wasn't really the son that Philip hoped he'd have. So as Charles grew, their relationship just didn't work. Philip would, sort of bark orders at Charles, and Charles would cringe and be timid. They just didn't rub along well together. Yes, Prince Philip felt very aggrieved by the fact that he wasn't able to give his own children his surname. Now, Prince Philip's family name had been Battenberg, but it was changed because it was too Germanic. It was changed from Battenberg to Mountbatten, and Philip wanted Mountbatten as the family name. He wanted it to be the House of Mountbatten. And when the royal circles, I think Queen Mary heard of this, she said, "No way is this going to be the House of Mountbatten. I'm not having Louis Mountbatten, attach his name to the immediate royal family." So it became the House of Windsor. And Philip was very, very hurt. So later on, it became Mountbatten Windsor, so that he could also have his name included.
New joy has come to the royal family in the birth to Princess Elizabeth at Clarence House of a second son. But of course, the joy is not restricted to the royal family, and messages of congratulation from all over the world have been pouring into the princess's home ever since the news became known. The early years of marriage have set the seal on the happiness of the princess and her husband. The blessing of children has come not only to enrich their lives, but also to establish securely the line of succession. In Prince Charles, the public has acquired a new popular subject of interest, of whom some delightful pictures have been taken. We should like to see more of him, but the insatiable demand of the public has had to bow to the princess's very proper determination that her son shall not be spoilt by publicity. The public will be no less curious to see the first pictures of his brother, to compare the likenesses and note the differences.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong. But I shall not have strength to carry out this resolution alone unless you join in it with me, as I now invite you to do. I know that your support will be unfailingly given. God help me to make good my vow, and God bless all of you who are willing to share in it.
Prince Philip was stationed in Malta on board his ship, and so the Queen would visit him every few months. And Prince Charles, it was their first child, was left behind, and then the Queen was able to actually sort of, for the first time and probably the only time in her life, be like any other housewife. Wasn't quite the same, but she was able to go shopping, she was able to have her hair done, she was able to drive around the island, and they all went to sort of like naval dances, and they just sort of joined in with the life of the other young naval officers and their wives. And it was, for her, it was just a huge pleasure. Well, I think the reason that the Queen is referred to by some historians as the unlikely Queen is that, you know, she wasn't prepared to be Queen. She was married in 1947, and she expected to have a proper, long-ish married life before her father, you know, died. But he died quite suddenly. So she was an unlikely Queen. And also she wasn't designated to be Queen because her uncle, who became Edward VIII very briefly, abdicated and put Elizabeth directly in the line of succession. What happened was the Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip were standing in for the King and Queen, and they started a big Commonwealth tour in Kenya, as it was called in those days. And the people of Kenya wanted them to be there, and they'd given them a lodge for their wedding present. And the sort of joy for them was that they were going to visit this game reserve, and there was a little place called Treetops, which was overlooking a salt lick, so you could really see the animals. You know, this is 1952, so the whole of Kenya was teeming with game, and they spent the night up there. And actually, it was during the night, unbeknownst to the princess, that she became queen. So they left their game viewing, went back to Sagana Lodge, and had a little sleep because they'd been up all night. When the news came across to Prince Philip's private secretary, Mike Parker, that the king had died, and he thought that he eventually had one of those little radios, and he fiddled with it, and eventually he heard the sounds of Big Ben, and he knew that the news was true. And it was his duty to tell Prince Philip, which was probably, he says later, the most difficult thing he'd ever had to do in his life. So he went to Prince Philip and told him the news that his wife, Prince Philip's wife, was queen. So Prince Philip was in such shock, he just put a newspaper over his face and let the news just absorb. And then he got up and he went and got the princess out of her bedroom where she was resting and took her down to the lake at the bottom of the garden. And the lady in waiting tells a wonderful story. She watched them walk up and down, and she knew that he was telling her. And when they walked back into the lodge, she was putting her arms around the princess, and she thought, my goodness, but she's queen, and dropped into a curtsy. And then, of course, they had to make their way back to England as quickly as possible. But by the time they arrived back at London Airport, she came down the steps, beautifully dressed in her black clothes, and Prince Philip waited on the steps until she was at the bottom, and she greeted her Prime Minister. And that's how it was going to be from then on. Princess Elizabeth became queen in February 1952, and the coronation was in June 1953. But there was no plan for her coronation. There had been a plan for her uncle's coronation, Edward VIII, but that had been scuppered. So it takes a long time to pull all the ends together. So it was decided that they would wait until June the following year, and then everything could be lined up, because for a coronation you've got to have all the heads of state from all the various countries, all the Commonwealth. So you couldn't just say, well, we're going to have it in November. Everybody needed time to organize things. Well, the historical significance of the coronation is that it's a very ancient ceremony, and the Queen, as she was by then, but she has to be anointed in the eyes of God, and that is the coronation ceremony. So she sits on the throne in a very simple white linen dress, and she has holy oil put on her forehead, and that makes her queen in the eyes of God, which is why she always said in all her speeches, you know, I will rule and I will do my duty, and as long as I'm fit and able to do so. So it's an anointing ceremony in the eyes of God, and that was the great importance of it. And then, of course, you've got all the pomp and ceremony of all the lords and the ladies and the dignitaries and the heads of state. So it was an enormous undertaking, and it was televised. When the Queen came to the throne, she was only 26, and Churchill made the remark to his private secretary, but she's a child. But she wasn't a child. She was very sophisticated and mature mentally, and it was a man's world, and you know, women were really subservient in those days. And the Queen was walking into this world of men who were all much, much older than her. And also she hadn't really, you know, been taught. She said there was no way to be taught. All she did was she watched what her father did and followed him. So, of course, the court was very old-fashioned and very stuffy, you know, because it was really her father's court. Well, Prince Philip had been in the Royal Navy. He was still in the Royal Navy when he married, so he was used to routine and regulations of royal life. But what he wasn't used to was the way the courtiers treated him, because they saw him as a foreigner and an interloper, and probably someone that wouldn't be faithful to his wife. So they didn't like him at all, and they made it very plain that they didn't like him. So he had a very, very difficult time. Very difficult indeed, and also eventually had to, you know, be 2 steps behind his wife. In the beginning, they had a very, very happy marriage, very happy marriage. They had Clarence House as their marital home, and they also had a country house which they rented in Windlesham Manor. So they had it all at the beginning, but it was for such a short time. I think The day-to-day life of the monarch is very regimented. I mean, she would be woken, that's about 7:30. She would have, her dresser would come in with a cup of tea and some biscuits for the dogs. You know, her clothes would be laid out. She would dress, have breakfast, and then read the newspapers and listen to the radio, and then her day would start, and her private secretary would bring her important letters to look at and sign. And then every 20 minutes during the day, there is an appointment. So it's the same every day during the working week. So it is a very regimented life.
At this moment of my Silver Jubilee, I want to thank all those in Britain and the Commonwealth who, through their loyalty and friendship, have given me strength and encouragement during these last 25 years. My thanks go also to the many thousands who have sent me messages of congratulations on my Silver Jubilee, that and their good wishes for the future. My Lord Mayor, when I was 21, I pledged my life to the service of our people, and I asked for God's help to make good that vow. Although that vow was made in my salad days when I was green in judgment, I do not regret nor retract one word of it.
Since Elizabeth rarely gave interviews, little is known of her personal feelings. As a constitutional monarch, she has not expressed her own political opinions in a public forum. She did have a deep sense of religious and civic duty and took her coronation oath seriously.
I think the characteristics that spring to mind to me are that she is stable, she's diligent, and she has an extraordinary ability to put duty before everything. And that is, you know, a characteristic that really doesn't exist anymore. But the Queen was probably the last person, you know, to decide that duty was everything. Duty became before personal happiness. Duty became before family and children. And that is the characteristic that defines her. And I think her stability also defines her, and the fact that she looks very somber, but then, you know, her face can crack into the most wonderful smile, and we learn over the years about her sense of humor and her ability with mimicry. So we've got to know her, but very gradually. Well, 1992 was the worst year of the Queen's life. And she gave a speech at the Mansion House in London towards the end of 92, and she said she was going to refer to the year as an annus horribilis, and we all knew why, because it was there was her daughter Princess Anne was separated, divorced, and remarried at the end of the year. Well, the remarriage was happy, but so her daughter's marriage had broken down. Fergie and Andrew's marriage had broken down, but far the worst thing was the breakdown of the marriage of the Prince and Princess of Wales. and the official announcement that they were going to split. And then on top of all that came the fire at Windsor Castle on the Queen's anniversary. A curtain caught upon a light in the chapel at Windsor Castle, and it just blazed, and the fire raced through all the state apartments. It was a huge fire. But lucky, very, very few things were lost, but it was devastating. And then the Prime Minister asked the country if they would be prepared to pay for the reconstruction of Windsor Castle, and basically the Queen's subjects said no. I mean, although Windsor Castle is an official state building, not her own, the general consensus was that we didn't want to pay for it. So then the Queen had to pay tax. And it just really wasn't a good year.
"1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis. I sometimes wonder how future generations will judge the events of this tumultuous year. I dare say that history will take a slightly more moderate view than that of some contemporary commentators. He who has never failed to reach perfection has a right to be the harshest critic. There can be no doubt, of course, that criticism is good for people and institutions that are part of public life. No institution, city, monarchy, whatever, should expect to be free from the scrutiny of those who give it their loyalty and support, not to mention those who don't. But we are all part of the same fabric of our national society, and that scrutiny by one part of another can be just as effective if it is made with a touch of gentleness, good humor, and understanding. This sort of questioning can also act, and it should do so, as an effective engine for change.
I think that the death of Princess Diana was the biggest crisis of the Queen's reign, and probably something that historically she will be judged by. And I think, despite the film The Queen, and despite The Crown, people still think the Queen handled it badly and didn't seem to understand what her subjects were feeling and thinking. But I think the Queen didn't understand, because traditionally, the royal family, when there is a death, and there've been many, many, they mourn quietly amongst themselves. And the Queen thought, because of William and Harry, it would be utter cruelty to expose them to crowds of wailing people, and that they must be kept at Balmoral. But it actually was wrong, as it turned out. But she remedied the situation, but I think it will still be seen as probably one of the disasters of her reign.
But I think our children have done rather well under very different and difficult and demanding circumstances. I hope we can be forgiven for feeling rather proud of them. And I'm also encouraged to see what a good start the next generation is making. I think that the main lesson that we've learned is that tolerance is the one essential ingredient of any happy marriage. It may not be quite so important when things are going well, but it is absolutely vital when things get difficult. And you can take it from me that the Queen has the quality of tolerance and abundance.
I think many people have asked the Queen and asked Prince Philip what is the secret of their relationship. And the Queen has spoken out on a few occasions. And she said, patience, sense of humour. And she said famously, of course, that Prince Philip had simply been her rock and her stay over the years. And he'd always been there to support her. Although he never involved himself in constitutional affairs, he was there as a sounding board. He was someone to listen and someone who would be on her side or would give her criticism, which of course nobody else really could.
All too often, I fear Prince Philip has had to listen to me speaking. Frequently, we have discussed my intended speech beforehand, and as you will imagine, his views have been expressed in a forthright manner. He is someone who doesn't take easily to compliments, but he has quite simply been my strength and stay all these years. And I and his whole family, and this and many other countries, owe him a debt greater than he would ever claim, or we shall ever know.
On the 9th of April 2021, Prince Philip sadly passed away at 99, only 2 months before his 100th birthday, leaving Elizabeth all alone after their 73 eventful years spent together.
I particularly wanted to say that my father, I suppose the last 70 years, has given the most remarkable, devoted service to the Queen, to my family, and to the country, and also to the whole of the Commonwealth. And as you can imagine, my family and I miss my father enormously. He was a much-loved and appreciated figure. And apart from anything else, I can imagine, and we're so deeply touched by the number of other people here and elsewhere around the world in the Commonwealth who also, I think, share our loss and our sorrow. And my dear Papa was a very special person who, I think, above all else, would have been amazed by the reaction and the touching things that have been said about him. And from that point of view, we are, my family, deeply grateful for all that. It will sustain us in this particular loss and at this particularly sad time.
Well, many people have asked Prince Philip how he wants to be remembered, and he says, typically, he says, well, I won't be around, so I don't care, do I? But I hope he'll be remembered for what he's done for conservation and what he's done for the sciences. I think he'll be remembered for his Duke of Edinburgh Award because it bears his name. And I think he will also be remembered for his gaffes, which is a bit of a shame. But I think when people think of Prince Philip, they think of, oh, Philip and the ladies, and Philip and his politically incorrect remarks. And sometimes those things stick.
In 2022, Queen Elizabeth II celebrated her Platinum Jubilee, 70 years of service, a first for any monarch in British history. Celebrations took place throughout the United Kingdom, the Commonwealth, and the world, as people came together to honour this historic milestone.
It has been a long day, but with the help of her walking stick, the Queen did press ahead with the beacon lighting at Windsor this evening. But by all accounts, the Jubilee events have taken their toll. She lit the beacons, but the palace said the Queen suffered some discomfort today and had pulled out to the big Thanksgiving service tomorrow. Despite tonight's news, this is how most people will remember today, when the Queen showed the world what celebrations for a 70-year reign look like. A balcony moment watched by tens of thousands on the Mall, as this 96-year-old monarch marked a moment in British history none of her predecessors has ever achieved.
Unfortunately, a few months later, the Queen passed away in her Platinum Jubilee year on the 8th of September 2022. The nation bid farewell to Britain's longest reigning monarch. After a state funeral, she was laid to rest alongside her husband, Prince Philip. They were reunited at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, where they may rest in peace together. It is almost impossible to imagine the great burden of responsibility carried by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II throughout her life. Still, there is no doubt that the unbreakable bond and closeness that she shared with her husband, and the love and support they have afforded one another, has carried them together and made the toils of life that much more worthwhile.